Hi. One of the questions that I'm often asked by students when I'm teaching about research methods is how big does my sample need to be? And the other thing that is quite often difficult to grasp is how people can use everyday observations and experiences in doing their research. So, quite often you'll have seen a particular show or you'll have had a particular interaction with a particular individual. And it's hard to see how you can turn that into a piece of research that's valuable and interesting. And that's a process that I want to explain to you over a series of 3 videos that are going to go through the logic of qualitative methods, the application of qualitative methods in media studies. And the third thing I'm going to do is talk about some actual examples of student work that's worked really well, that's been based on small scale qualitative methods. In this first video, I'm just going to talk about the logic of qualitative research methods, where they come from, why they're there, what they're supposed to do, and then also focus that particularly on the methods of oral history and life histories, both of which are based on the method of interview. And I also want to think about how you can develop research topics by thinking not about data, but about experiences. So, quite often we might think about developing a research method by picking a media theory and then trying to find something that fits that theory. But there's another way around of doing it, which is by starting from the point of view of an everyday observation. And knowing a little bit more about qualitative methods helps us do that. So let's move through the presentation. Um, so, oh, so I'm just going to show you. Sorry, the right here. The work that I'm doing is based on 2 really useful readings from a resource called Sage Online Research Methods, which for my students is available via the Monash University Library, but 2 pieces by William Tierney and Michael Lanford on life history methods, and Alistair Thompson and Robert Perks on oral history methods. And what these pieces are both about is how you can address important, historically significant research questions by talking to individuals and small groups. And this relates directly to the question of how big does my sample need to be if I'm doing qualitative research? And of course, the annoying answer is it depends. And it depends on what you're trying to do. But I think the point that I want to bear in mind is the idea that over the years, sociologists, anthropologists, historians have become very good at doing a lot with a little, and doing that by being imaginative. And the imagination qualitative research Ubermeister, in my opinion, is without doubt Howard Becker, a fantastic sociologist who, interesting story, in I believe it was the 1940s. So he's one of the Chicago School of Sociology, and in the 1940s, he is augmenting his income as a PhD student by performing as a jazz musician. And this is him performing as a jazz musician up here. And in the course of that work, he became kind of interested in a particular phenomenon. And one of the things that he noticed was that he could quite commonly, he was a jobbing pianist, and he could show up at a jazz club and meet a bunch of musicians who he'd never met before, and within about 20 minutes they could bang out a pretty passable tune, even though they didn't know each other. And he realized that they could do that because they all understood the rules of jazz, and therefore it was easy to kind of fit in. And therefore he became really interested in how that phenomenon worked as a sociological reality. How can strangers come together and learn to coordinate their behavior through the sharing of rules? And as he reflected on it later on, that in the process of doing that and going around all these clubs, he had gathered a pretty interesting overall history of the development jazz in Chicago in the 1940s. So this was an example of how um, Becker really, one of the things that really built his reputation was his ability to understand how the things that were going on around him could develop into a resource. And he was able to do this because this fitted very well into the Chicago School of Sociology's larger project, which was about bringing to light sorts of lifestyles, values, and cultures that most of us don't see. Becker was very interested also in how being a jazz musician, to be a jazz musician was to be something of an outsider. It was to be seen as someone who is somewhat outside of society, someone who is viewed with suspicion because jazz was associated at the time with all kinds of social ills such as drug taking and all of this kind of thing. And that very much fitted into the project of the Chicago School of Sociology, which was about looking at the life of so-called deviants, outsiders, people who didn't fit into the rules of normal, conventional everyday culture. So what we begin to see is the way that Becker use small scale studies to address a bigger problem, which was what did it mean to be a deviant, part of a deviant group in society, and what could we learn about mainstream society by studying outsiders. And this was also important because the other thing that the development of qualitative methods, and when I'm talking about qualitative methods, I'm talking about things like talking to people talking, for example, to a particular family about how they've introduced, how do parents manage the introduction of Minecraft into the family home? How do they set up rules around that type of thing? Or talking to individuals about, if you talk to your grandparents, for example, about what was it like to have the telephone for the first time or the television or whatever it is, what's the point of that? Well, the idea is that it actually tells us something that numbers don't. One of the things we need to realize is that qualitative methods in social research developed in reaction to the shortcomings of quantitative methods that had really grabbed a hold of social science research in the early 20th century. So there was a certain move toward thinking that the only kind of knowledge that was worth having was the sort of knowledge that could be measured and quantified with great precision. And of course, one of the things we all know is that surveys are great for certain things, but they don't tell us everything that we want to know about the human condition. And ironically, one of the clearest accounts of this comes from Nate Silver, who, of course, is something of a maestro of big data. And one of the things that makes Nate Silver worth reading is he's very clear and very precise about what big data doesn't tell you, and about the problems of using big data to try and describe social reality. And the fact that, quite often recently, big data has been really bad at predicting things like election outcomes, just simply reminds us, according to Nate Silver, that there are certain things you can do with surveys, but there's lots of other things that you can't do with surveys. And I suppose to illustrate this, maybe right now, look at your social media, look at your Instagram or whatever, and look at the products it's trying to tell you. And you might have the experience, if you're anything like me, of, 4 or 5 times they'll be right, but every now and again, oh my goodness, they'll be wrong. You might like this. No, actually, quite the opposite. And that's an example of the fact that numbers give us a best guess of what your life is like, but they can't tell us really what it's like. They can't tell us in deep grain what it's like to be you, and therefore they can't really tell us in any real depth what it's like, what it feels like to live in a particular culture at a particular moment. And this is where qualitative methods come in. So, I suppose if we look at things like oral histories, life histories, talking to people about their life experiences, talking to people about what it was like to live through certain times, talking to either individuals or small groups, we see that the purpose of this is to find out, how does history feel? What was it like to live through certain moments in time? And there are certain things that are involved here which are quite the opposite from surveys. So surveys skip over the surface of things, right? So if you're asked who you're going to vote for in a particular election, you're never asked why you would make that decision. And of course, the why you would make that decision is very, very important. So, what qualitative research is really about is, and I've thrown some kind of some buzzwords in here. It's about deep listening and thick description. It's about spending a lot of time with someone or a group of people and painting a really detailed question of how they see reality. Um, and it's but then the other thing is that we're talking about not only talking to people about things that have happened to them, but spending a lot of time thinking about how those experiences relate to external factors, history, culture, and in our example also media industries. How does the structure of media industries influence the things that people do in everyday social situations? Now, what I've got over here is Lewis Worth's The Ghetto, and this again was part of that whole Chicago sociology tradition of going off into parts of society, amongst groups of society that we rarely hear from, and finding out what life is like for them. How do they experience the economic, political, and cultural realities that define a particular historical context? So, what we're saying here is that in that Chicago tradition, the processes of qualitative talking to people, collecting their life stories, or talking to them about how they experience certain things like hunger, poverty, drug dependency. This is a really useful way of finding out how people actually experience society. And this paints a important historical picture that fills in some of the gaps that quantitative data will never tell us. So qualitative data will tell us how many people at a particular moment in time were drug dependent or were considered poor, but it won't really tell us what life was like for those people. And when it won't tell us what life was like for those people, it means that we can't really understand them. So these are the logics of qualitative research. And in the next video, I'm going to tell you how these sorts of ideas have shown up in media research.